Dobro. History. Archive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on a really monumental story. It's about wealth, ethics, and sheer survival, spanning 3 centuries in Korea.
Oh, that's right. We're talking about the Gyeongju Choe clan, a dynasty that somehow managed to hold on to immense fortune and also social standing for an astonishing 12 generations.
Now, if you've heard about this family before, maybe in Korean media, you've probably encountered this sort of boiled-down version. It usually has this title. The 6 brothers, 60 billion won sacrifice. It sounds very dramatic, right? A tragic tale of selfless financial ruin. But, well, our deep dive today is going to show that the truth is actually far more strategic, more complex, and frankly, pretty genius.
Yeah, we really have to start right there with that common story. It's become a kind of modern folklore, and our mission today is, well, to cut through that myth. We need to understand the really quite sophisticated risk strategy that let this family survive everything: political purges, economic collapse, even colonial occupation.
Okay, so where does the popular story go wrong? What are the core misconceptions?
There are 2 main ones we need to tackle right away. First, that whole 6 brothers thing, it's basically a journalistic mix-up. The sources are clear. This doesn't mean 6 actual siblings pooling their money.
Not literal brothers.
No. It refers directly to the 6 precepts. That's the Yuk-hun in Korean. This was the family's code of conduct, their guiding principles, and it was ironclad for centuries. That code, the Yuk-hun, was the real engine behind their lasting power, not a group of brothers sacrificing cash.
Okay, 6 precepts, not 6 brothers. Got it.
Right.
What's the second misconception?
The 60 billion won, the 600 iuk, it's a huge number, grabs your attention.
Right.
But it's not like someone wrote a check for 60 billion won. It's a modern valuation done in the 21st century by journalists trying to put a number on the total value of all the assets. The land, the buildings, the grain stores, everything that the last heir, Choe Jun, liquidated back in 1947.
So it's a retrospective estimate of the final sacrifice, not an amount pooled by brothers earlier on.
Exactly. So we're not really discussing 6 brothers. We're talking about one man, the 12th generation heir, Choe Jun, taking this entire 300-year legacy and consciously dissolving it, turning it into a public national asset. That act, that self-liquidation, that's the real climax here.
Okay, that's much clearer. Now, before we really dive into their story, there's one critical warning we need to mention, something the background materials flag.
Yes, very important.
Because the popular myth uses the word brothers. Sources warned about a potential and really tragic confusion. People might mistakenly link this story to the completely separate history of the brothers' home, the 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄 one.
Which was that horrific internment camp situation in the 1970s and 80s, a truly dark chapter in Korean human rights history.
Absolutely. So we need to be crystal clear. The philanthropic history of the Gyeongju Choe clan we're discussing today has absolutely nothing to do with the brothers' home tragedy. They are completely unrelated.
Essential distinction. Okay, so with that clarified, we can focus on the real subject. This incredible 12-generation saga of the Gyeongju Choe clan. They were known across Korea simply as the Gyeongju Bujetjip,
Which means?
Gyeongju's richest family. And they weren't kidding. Their main family compound, for example, famously had 99 rooms.
99. Why that specific number?
Well, traditionally in Korea, that was the maximum size allowed for a house that wasn't a royal palace. So building a 99-room house was basically the ultimate statement of aristocratic wealth and status, just short of challenging the king. It confirms how incredibly wealthy and high status they were within the Yangban, the traditional aristocracy.
And this is the part that just statistically seems impossible. They didn't just survive for 12 generations, they thrived. That flies in the face of that common Korean saying, right? The one about wealth not lasting.
Fortune rarely passes down to the 3rd generation.
Yes.
And historically, that saying holds true for most wealthy families, not just in Korea, but everywhere. Aristocracies tend to crumble decadence, bad political bets, debt, infighting.
But the Choe family somehow dodged all of that for 300 years.
They did. And that brings us right to the core idea, the central thesis we're going to unpack today based on the sources. Their incredible longevity wasn't in spite of their famous, almost legendary generosity, which sometimes looked ruinous from the outside.
Right. It seems like giving away wealth would make you less likely to survive.
But it was the opposite. Their survival was a direct result of that generosity. The Gyeongju Cho clan were fundamentally masters of risk management.
Well-
They deliberately, continuously exchanged what you might call temporary vulnerable wealth, like stores of rice, land holdings, for something much more durable.
Which was?
Social capital, community loyalty, and absolute political neutrality. Their generosity wasn't just kindness, it was their armor. It was their insurance policy.
Okay, this is fascinating. Let's unpack this 300-year story then. Starting at the beginning, part 1. The foundation of a moral dynasty, back in the 17th century. So where did this immense wealth actually begin? Like many aristocratic fortunes, it seems to have started with military service and land.
That's right. The initial groundwork was laid by a man named Choe Jun. He was already a prominent Yangban patriarch. His family's wealth and social standing got a significant boost from his contributions during a really turbulent period, the Japanese invasions of the late 16th century.
That would be the Imjin War.
Exactly. The Imjin War from 1592 to 1598, and then the follow-up invasion, the Gyeongju in 1597. These were devastating wars for the Joseon dynasty, truly existential threats.
And Choe Jun played a role.
Yes, his service, probably things like providing troops, maybe resources, perhaps leadership, earned him rewards from the state. This included government posts, but critically for our story, it included land. Land that was either confiscated from others or granted as a reward. This formed the initial economic base for the dynasty.
Okay, so a fairly standard origin for a powerful family back then. But you mentioned earlier that things started to change ethically with the next generation.
Yes, the real shift, the point where they start deviating from the typical path of a powerful landowning family, comes with Choe Jun-rip's son, Choe Dong-rang. He's the one who really expanded the family's landholdings, acquiring vast tracts of farmland. But crucially, he adopted a very different and ethical management style right from the start.
Different how? What was the standard practice?
Well, think about how these large estates usually worked in Joseon, Korea. The wealthy landowner, the Yangban, rarely dirtied their hands dealing directly with the tenant farmers working the land.
They'd use intermediaries.
Exactly. They relied on middlemen, go-betweens, estate managers, and these figures often had their own incentives, which usually involved extracting the absolute maximum rent possible from the tenants, sometimes through pretty coercive or manipulative means. This naturally created a lot of resentment, simmering anger that could, and often did, boil over into local unrest or even revolts.
Okay, so that was the norm. What did Choe Dong-rang do?
He just bypassed that whole system. He insisted on dealing directly with his tenant farmers. Just doing that immediately built a level of trust that wasn't typical. But the really radical part was his rent policy.
The low rents. Tell us about that.
He became famous for leasing out his land at low fixed rates. The policy was often summarized as taking only half the harvest as rent.
Only half. How low was that compared to others?
Extremely low. During the Joseon period, especially in tough years, it wasn't uncommon for landlords to demand 60%, 70%, even 80% of the harvest. Think about what that means for the farmer. They're living constantly on the edge of starvation. It also meant tenant farmers didn't have much loyalty. They'd move on if they thought they could get a slightly better deal elsewhere. High turnover, low morale.
So on the face of it, Choe Dong-rang leaving 50% for the farmer looks like he's just leaving money on the table. Was this purely about being nice, or was there something else going on?
This is where you start to see the strategic brilliance, even this early. The sources we have suggest that this approach, which looks purely altruistic, actually ended up being more profitable in the long run. It significantly increased yields.
Increased yields. How?
Because the farmers had security. They had a real stake in the outcome. If you're a tenant farmer and you know for sure you get to keep a fair 50% of whatever you grow, you're much more motivated.
Right.
You'll invest your own time and effort into improving the soil, maybe fixing irrigation ditches, working harder to maximize the total harvest. You benefit directly.
Right, okay. So if the total harvest goes up by, say, 20%, because the farmers are actually motivated in investing their own labor.
Then the Choe family's 50% share of that larger harvest could actually be more rice than another landlord might get by demanding 70% from a smaller, poorly managed harvest produced by resentful tenants.
It's like an early form of efficiency wages, almost. Pay more, get more loyalty and productivity.
In an agrarian context, yes. It absolutely secured tenant loyalty, which was a huge asset, and it ensured the long-term health and productivity of the land itself. Choe Dong-rang seemed to understand very early on that his most valuable asset wasn't just the dirt. It was the skilled, loyal workforce farming that dirt.
That stability, that foundation, was about to be tested severely, wasn't it, under the next generation?
Yes, under Chonongrang's son, Choe Jun. He faced the defining crisis for this early phase of the dynasty, the Great Gyeongju famine of 1671. This happened during the reign of King Haejong.
And this wasn't just a bad year for crops.
No, this was a catastrophic nationwide disaster. We're talking about widespread starvation, social breakdown, people resorting to desperate measures. It was a moment that forced every wealthy family in Korea to make a fundamental choice.
What choice?
Are you going to exploit this disaster? Use the desperation to buy up land cheap, lend money at killer rates, consolidate your power, or are you going to invest in the survival of the community around you?
And Choe Jun.
He chose the community. There's a famous quote attributed to him from this time. What is the point of being rich when everyone around us is starving to death?
Wow. That's quite a statement.
It is. And it wasn't just talk. It reflects, I think, a deep strategic understanding, maybe intuitive, maybe calculated, that your wealth is ultimately worthless if the society that supports it completely collapses. Dead tenants can't farm your land.
So what did he actually do? His response was apparently quite radical and very public.
Extremely public. It was almost like a masterclass in public relations during a crisis. First, he set up a huge pot, sometimes described as a large cauldron, right in the main yard of the family compound.
A huge pot. For what?
To cook porridge. Every day they cooked enormous batches of rice porridge and ladled it out to anyone who came, anyone starving in the region. This very visible, very direct act of feeding people immediately established them as saviors, as patrons looking after the community.
That must have had a huge impact on their reputation.
Immense. But the truly revolutionary part, perhaps even more impactful long-term, was the economic action he took. He publicly burned debt contracts.
Burned dead contracts. Explain that. What was the significance?
Okay, think about the economics of a famine. For most landowners, this was prime time for expansion. Starving farmers would be forced to borrow money or grain just to survive, usually putting up their land as collateral, when they inevitably couldn't repay.
The landlord takes the land.
Exactly. Predatory lending was rampant. It was the fastest way for the rich to get richer and consolidate land holdings during crises. Choe Jun did the absolute opposite.
He refused to profit from the misery.
More than refused. The sources say that on the eve of his death, which happened shortly after the famine's peak, he gathered all the IOUs, all the loan documents people owed his family. He returned land deeds that might have been held as collateral, and then he publicly burned the debt records, forgave it all.
Wow. So he actively chose not to expand his land holdings at the easiest possible time?
He deliberately limited his family's short-term financial gain in order to preserve the long-term social fabric of the community. It was an incredible act.
And this wasn't just a one-off gesture. He made it policy.
He institutionalized it. He decreed that from then on, a mandatory, non-negotiable 1/3 of the entire estate's annual rental income must be set aside and used specifically for poverty relief.
1/3. That's a huge chunk of their income.
It's enormous. It essentially became a constitutional requirement for the family, an operating expense built into their budget generation after generation.
So what was the result of all this? The porridge, the debt burning, the mandated relief fund?
It created what some scholars call the symbiotic model. By providing famine relief and refusing to engage in predatory practices, Choe Jun ensured, first, that his workforce, his tenants, actually survived the crisis. But more than that, he secured their deep-seated loyalty and gratitude for generations to come.
So the high productivity we talked about earlier continued.
Even more so. The tenants were reportedly treated with such unusual fairness and compassion that they were described as being eager to work the Choe family's land. Again, that translated directly into remarkably high productivity. Happy workers are good workers.
And it provided security in other ways, too.
Absolutely. Think about the social dynamics. While other rich families, especially those who got richer during the famine, became targets of jealousy, resentment, maybe even violence or revolt, which was a constant threat in Joseon society.
The Choe family became beloved, protected.
Yeah, exactly. They became a treasured local institution. Their generosity effectively built a social moat around their wealth. If trouble brewed, maybe political instability, maybe bandits roaming the area, the local people would have actively defended the Choe estate. They were protecting their own lifeline.
So the moral decision was also the strategically sound decision for long-term survival.
Precisely. Their generosity was their insurance. They consciously traded short-term, potentially explosive wealth accumulation for long-term, stable, protected prosperity. It's an incredibly far-sighted perspective.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
And this whole philosophy, this way of operating, it then gets formalized, right? Codified into a set of rules.
Yes. That act of codification by Choe Jun, likely right after the famine experience, leads us directly into part 2, the family constitution itself.
Okay, so after living through that famine and responding the way he did, Choe Jun creates the Yuk-hun. The 6 precepts, or maybe 6 principles. It's the family's 𝐏𝐻, their motto or code.
And this wasn't just, some nice sayings framed on the wall. The sources emphasize this was treated as an inviolable constitution for the dynasty. For 12 generations, this code governed their actions.
And you're arguing this Yuk-hun is the real secret to their 300-year success.
I think the evidence strongly suggests it. When you break down these 6 rules, you see they're not just about being nice. They form a comprehensive system of self-limitation. And that system seems perfectly designed as a risk management strategy, political risk, economic risk, social risk.
How so?
Yeah.
What were the main threats they were managing?
In Joseon, Korea, for a wealthy family like the Choe clan, there were 2 existential threats. First, the state itself, the government, the king. Powerful court factions could seize your wealth, especially if you got involved in politics and picked the wrong side.
Okay, threat 1. The state.
Second threat, the populace. If you became too wealthy, too arrogant, too exploitative, you risked peasant revolts, local uprisings, resentment that could turn violent. The Yuk-hun seems deliberately crafted to neutralize both of these threats.
All right, let's go through them one by one. Rule number 1, do not take a government post higher than jinsa.
Okay, first, what's a jinsa? In the Joseon social hierarchy, achieving jinsa status meant you'd pass the lower civil service examination, the samasi. For a Yangban family, producing jinsa was crucial. It proved your scholarly credentials, your legitimacy as part of the educated elite.
So it was a necessary qualification for an aristocratic family.
Absolutely, and the Choe family did produce them. The records show 9 jinsa over the centuries. They weren't shunning education or status. However, the jinsa status itself didn't grant you real political power. It wasn't a ticket to becoming a government minister or a provincial governor or a high-ranking inspector.
And the rule explicitly forbids seeking those higher posts.
Yes. The family intentionally, consistently, generation after generation, avoided seeking high political office.
But yes, for most Yangban families, wasn't political power the ultimate prize? The whole point of accumulating wealth and status. Refusing high office seems like deliberately handicapping yourself.
From a conventional Yangban perspective, maybe, but from a risk management perspective, it was genius. Think about Joseon court politics. It was incredibly volatile, often described as a blood sport.
Factional strife.
Exactly. Constant vicious struggles between different political factions, Noron versus Soron, Namin versus Bukin, and so on. When one faction gained the upper hand, they would often ruthlessly purge the losing faction. These purges, called sawa, were brutal.
Purges meaning
execution, exile, imprisonment, not just for the key ministers, but often for their entire extended families. And crucially, their property, all their land, their wealth would be confiscated by the state.
So getting involved in high politics, aiming for a ministerial position, was essentially like playing Russian roulette with your entire family fortune.
Precisely. The potential rewards, power, prestige were huge, but the risks were existential. The Choe clan made a calculated decision. They valued the security and longevity of their wealth more than the temporary power and glory of high office.
They chose wealth preservation over political ambition.
By maintaining absolute political neutrality, by staying out of the cabinet battles, they insulated their fortune from the single biggest threat, state seizure due to political fallout. They kept their heads down, politically speaking. Their wealth was large enough to live very comfortably, and their political profile was low enough to avoid becoming a target. It's profound wisdom, really. Choose longevity over fleeting power.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, that political neutrality connects directly to the next rule, doesn't it? The economic self-limitation. Rule number 2, do not amass a fortune larger than 10,000 suk.
Yes, this is perhaps the most famous rule, the economic cap. A man-suk gun was the term used for a millionaire landowner in Joseon times, someone whose estate generated 10,000 suk of rice in annual income.
And how much rice is that, roughly? Give us a sense of scale.
10,000 suk. It's around 800,000 kilograms of rice, maybe close to 1.8 million pounds. To generate that much income, you'd need an enormous amount of land. Estimates vary, but maybe something like 250,000 to 300,000 pyong of prime farmland. It's a vast estate.
So they were undeniably rich, among the wealthiest families in their region for sure, But they put a hard ceiling on it. Again, I have to ask from a purely economic standpoint, why limit your growth? Why not aim for 20,000 suk or 50,000? How do they even enforce this? What happened if they had a really good harvest and went over the limit?
It seems to have been enforced primarily by the strength of the family tradition, the Yuk-hun itself. And the rule was explicit. If the family income did exceed the 10,000 sik threshold in a given year, that surplus had to be returned to society immediately.
Returned how?
Through the very mechanisms we've already discussed. Funding the poverty relief efforts, opening the granaries wider, providing even more generous hospitality, perhaps lowering rents even further the following year. It was a built-in mandatory dispersal mechanism for any excess wealth.
Okay, so the surplus wasn't just hoarded or hidden, it had to go out. What was the strategic purpose of this cap?
It served several critical functions, I think. First, it prevented them from becoming too conspicuously wealthy, too overwhelmingly dominant in the region. If their fortune had ballooned to, say, 20,000 or 30,000 sik, they would have become an unavoidable target.
A target for whom?
For the central government, primarily. A private fortune that large could be seen as a potential rival power base, making it politically expedient for someone in Seoul to find a pretext, any pretext, to seize it. The 10,000 sik cap kept them rich enough to be influential locally, but perhaps not quite rich enough to pose an existential threat that demanded state intervention. It kept them somewhat under the radar.
Managed visibility.
Exactly. And the second major function of the cap was that it forced the continuous, systematic conversion of vulnerable financial capital rice sitting in a granary into durable social capital.
Explain that conversion.
Well, rice can spoil, it can be stolen, it can be confiscated. It's a tangible but vulnerable asset. By mandating that any surplus rice be immediately distributed as charity or social investment, they were essentially spending that surplus rice to buy things like community loyalty, respect, gratitude, and security. These are intangible assets, but incredibly durable ones.
So instead of piling up rice, they were piling up goodwill.
You could put it that way. It was like a self-imposed tax. But they controlled exactly where the tax revenue went directly into strengthening their relationship with the local community. It transformed potential resentment, they have too much, into appreciation. They share what they have. This is a key reason why, unlike many other wealthy estates, the Choe family seemingly never faced a serious local uprising or revolt. Their wealth was seen as beneficial, not threatening.
That principle, that strategic generosity, seems to be the absolute core of the next rule, too. Rule number 3. Never purchase land from farmers during a year of bad harvest.
Yes, this rule hits right at the heart of ethical conduct in an agrarian society. It explicitly forbade the single most common and arguably most predatory method of wealth accumulation available to landowners.
Which was buying land cheap during famines.
Exactly. As we discussed with Choe Jun, famines were the moments of maximum vulnerability for small farmers. They'd face starvation, need grain immediately, and the only asset they usually had was their ancestral land. Wealthy landowners could, and routinely did, exploit this desperation, offering a pittance for land deeds. It was land consolidation via misery.
And the Choe family just refused.
Be refused, point blank. Not only did they refuse to buy land under those circumstances, but as we saw with Choe Jun actions, they often went in the opposite direction, providing food aid and even burning the debt contracts that might otherwise have forced farmers to sell their land.
It's a complete rejection of short-term opportunism. They were willing to forego massive potential gains in land holdings
in order to build something they valued more: unwavering tenant loyalty and a reputation for ethical dealing. By refusing to profit from desperation, they cemented this perception that they were partners with the community, not predators. Their tenants, their neighbors, felt the Choe family's prosperity was linked to their own well-being. That belief provided incredible stability over centuries.
Okay, let's move to rule number 4. This one sounds incredibly demanding. Let no one starve to death within a 100-li, 40-kilometer radius.
This is really the ultimate statement of the Choe clan accepting responsibility as the regional safety net. And you're right, the scale is staggering. A 100-li radius is about 40 kilometers, or roughly 25 miles. That's a huge area to be responsible for ensuring basic survival. It required constant awareness and critically vast reserves of grain.
How did they actually implement this? How did they distribute aid on that scale?
One famous method they used was the 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄. It literally translates to something like whole rice chest.
Whole rice chest.
Yes, they would apparently install these very large wooden chests filled with rice in accessible places, maybe in the outer yard of their compound, and these chests had a hole cut into them. Anyone in need, day or night, could come and take rice from the hole.
Anyone could just take it. Did they track who took it?
That's the crucial detail. The sources suggest it was largely anonymous. You didn't have to ask permission, you didn't have to register, you didn't have to humble yourself before the patriarch. You just took what you needed.
Why the anonymity? Would they want to know who they were helping, maybe keep track, ensure loyalty later?
That's what makes it so psychologically astute, I think.
Yeah.
By making it anonymous, they preserve the dignity of the person receiving help. It shifted the dynamic away from transactional charity, I give you rice, you owe me loyalty, towards something more like fulfilling a public duty. It made the aid feel less like a personal handout and more like an institutional right, something the community could rely on, guaranteed by the Choe family. That fosters a deeper, more genuine kind of respect, not just obligation.
So it wasn't about creating dependence, but about upholding community welfare.
Precisely. And during major famines or crises, this wasn't just about the hole in the chest. They would open their main granaries, the sources say, distributing rice until the stores were almost empty. This level of mandated generosity made the Choe estate, in effect, the local government for social welfare. They were the safety net for the entire region.
Which, again, comes back to risk management.
Absolutely. If the actual government was weak or distant, or if bandits were active, who would dare attack the Choe family compound? You'd be attacking the very institution, keeping potentially thousands of people alive within that 40-kilometer radius. The community itself became their security force, their militia, because the family's survival was directly linked to the community's survival. Their wealth wasn't just in the region, it was interwoven with the region's well-being.
Incredible. Okay, rule number 5 is interesting too. Treat all passersby generously. It sounds like basic politeness, but the analysis suggests it was more than that.
Oh, much more than just good manners. This rule involved a significant ongoing expenditure. The sources estimate the family spent something like 80,000 kilograms of grain annually just on hospitality.
80,000 kilos a year on guests. Who are these guests?
All sorts. Their compound essentially became a mandatory stopover point for anyone traveling through the Gyeongju region. We're talking itinerant scholars, wandering poets and artists, traveling merchants bringing goods from other provinces, even minor government officials passing through. Dozens of guests, potentially every single day, needing food and lodging.
Why invest so heavily in hosting strangers? What was the payoff?
Information. This rule effectively turned their house into a massive intelligence gathering hub. Remember, this was long before newspapers, telegraphs, or any kind of mass media. How did you find out what was really happening in the capital, Hanyang, modern Seoul, or in other provinces?
From travelers.
Exactly. By lavishly hosting these passersby, the Choe family gained access to a constant stream of real-time information. News about court politics, which faction was up, which was down, rumors of potential military movements or policy changes, news about crop prices or conditions in other regions, economic intelligence, political intelligence.
So they were essentially trading grain for information.
Precisely. Knowing that a particular minister was about to fall from grace, or that the government was planning a new land survey or tax assessment, that kind of advance information was incredibly valuable. It allowed them to anticipate changes, protect their assets, maybe make shrewder decisions about managing their estate. It was strategic networking and intelligence gathering, brilliantly disguised as simple, generous hospitality. They weren't just the richest family, they were probably the best informed family in the region.
That's fascinating. Okay, finally, rule number 6. This one seems different, more internally focused. Daughters-in-law must wear cotton clothes for 3 years.
Yes, this one is about managing the internal culture of the family. And it applied regardless of the bride's background, even if she came from an equally wealthy or prestigious family herself.
So a new bride, maybe used to wearing fine silk in her own home, marries into the Choe family, and she has to wear plain cotton for 3 years. Why?
It was essentially an inoculation against aristocratic decadence. It was a way to prevent the family from rotting from within, which is often how wealthy dynasties collapse. The danger is always that the later generations, born into privilege, lose touch with the common people, lose sight of the value of hard work, become arrogant, extravagant, and disconnected.
Which makes them vulnerable both internally through infighting or mismanagement and externally by breeding resentment.
Exactly. This rule forced every new member joining the family through marriage, especially the women who would manage the household, to experience a period of mandatory frugality. They had to wear the same simple cotton clothes as the common folk. They were often put in charge of managing the household stores, understanding the accounts, seeing firsthand the value of every single grain of rice.
It's like enforced empathy training.
You could call it that. It fostered humility. It ensured they understood, at a practical level, the lives of the tenants and commoners whose labor ultimately supported the family's wealth. It was a check against arrogance, a way to keep the family grounded and connected to the base of their prosperity.
It's quite remarkable, the kind of cultural engineering.
Yeah.
They managed external threats through generosity and political neutrality, and they managed the internal threat of decay through enforced humility.
So if you put all 6 rules together, the Yuk-hun, you see this coherent system. It's like a third way they carved out for themselves. They decoupled their financial security from the state by avoiding high office, thus dodging political seizure. They embedded their social status within the community by sharing wealth, thus avoiding peasant revolts. And they maintained internal discipline through enforced humility. It was an incredibly comprehensive playbook for generational wealth survival, and the proof is in the pudding. It worked for 300 years.
An amazing system. But of course, the world didn't stay the same. The 20th century brought changes and challenges far beyond what the Joseon dynasty could have imagined.
Indeed. And that brings us to the final act, the ultimate test of this 300-year-old code.
Right, the Yuk-hun was brilliantly designed for the risks of Joseon dynasty Korea. But then comes the 20th century, and everything changes. The biggest change, of course, being the Japanese colonial occupation, lasting from 1910 all the way to 1945.
This is the era of the 12th and final generation heir we mentioned earlier, Choe Jun. He lived from 1884 to 1970. He was the last Manseuk-gun of the Gyeongju Cho clan, the last one to inherit that vast fortune capped at 10,000 𝐃. And he faced a completely new reality. The challenge for him was, how do you apply this deeply ingrained local agrarian code of ethics in the face of brutal colonial rule and a burgeoning national independence movement?
You had to reinterpret the rules for a national stage.
He had to scale them up. His response really came in 2 major phases. Phase 1 was during the occupation itself from 1910 to 1945, resistance financing. He essentially decided that the Yuk-hun's mandate to feed the starving and support the community now meant supporting the Korean nation's struggle for freedom.
How did he do that? Was he openly defiant?
No, that would have been suicide. He was incredibly careful, a strategic conspirator. Outwardly, he maintained the image of a wealthy, respectable landowner and businessman, successfully managing his estates under the Japanese colonial administration. He had to appear compliant to survive, but secretly he became one of the most crucial financial backers of the Korean independence movement.
How did he channel the money? It must have been incredibly dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. His main vehicle for this was a company called the Baeksan Trading Company, or Baeksan Sengho. We need to understand this company because it wasn't just him writing checks, it was a sophisticated front operation.
A front? What did it trade?
Choe Jun was a co-founder and a major, perhaps the major, financial backer. But the company was run publicly by a close friend of his, An Hae-jae, who was himself a prominent independence activist. The company's legitimate business involved trading things like cotton fabrics, rice, salt, basic goods between Korea, particularly the Busan area, and Manchuria.
Okay, so it looked like a normal import-export business.
Exactly. And that legitimate trade provided the perfect cover. The substantial profits generated from the Cho family's vast land holdings, that rental income were secretly funneled into Baeksan Trading. The company then acted as a mechanism to launder this money and secretly transmit a great deal of money, as the sources put it, out of Korea, bypassing the intense Japanese surveillance to support activists.
Where did the money go? Who received it?
A significant portion went directly to the Korean Provisional Government, the KPG, which was operating in exile, mostly in Shanghai at that time. Choe Jun provided crucial financial support to key leaders of the independence movement, most famously Kim Koo, who would later become the last premier of the KPG.
What was the money used for?
Everything. Funding the operations of the KPG itself, supporting the families of activists who were in exile or prison, printing independence literature and newspapers, maybe even funding paramilitary training or operations associated with the Korean Liberation Army. Choe Jun wasn't just a passive donor. He apparently served in a financial oversight role for some independence organizations, too.
This is incredible. He was using the family fortune, built over centuries of careful risk management, to fund what the Japanese considered treason.
Absolute treason. And the sources are clear that he paid a personal price. He didn't escape suspicion entirely. He endured torture by Japanese police on multiple occasions, specifically because they suspected him of financing independence activities. He was also imprisoned for his role. He was consciously putting his life, his family, and the entire 300-year legacy on the line for the national cause. It was the Yuk-hun applied at the highest possible stakes.
Then comes 1945. Liberation. But Korea's plunged into chaos. This leads to phase 2 of his response, right? The final sacrifice.
Yes. Between 1945 and 1947, liberation wasn't a smooth transition. The country was in turmoil. The colonial economy completely collapsed. The peninsula was suddenly, tragically divided at the 38th parallel, and the U.S. military government, which was administering the South, was frankly unprepared for the scale of the crisis.
What were the immediate problems?
Catastrophic economic disorganization, as the sources term it. Infrastructure was damaged or neglected. The division was devastating economically, something like 92% of the peninsula's electricity generation, and most of the heavy industry was now in the north, inaccessible to the south. This led to severe shortages of everything: food, power, basic goods. Inflation was rampant. Political instability was everywhere.
And there was another critical shortage too, wasn't there? A human one.
Yes, this was crucial. When the Japanese administrators, technicians, engineers, and managers suddenly left after the surrender, they left behind a massive vacuum. Under colonial rule, Koreans had been largely excluded from high-level positions in government and industry. So, newly independent South Korea found itself desperately lacking trained, experienced people capable of running a modern economy, a modern state.
So Choe Jun looked at this situation.
And he identified the most critical famine facing the newly liberated nation. It wasn't just a famine of rice this time, it was a famine of human capital. The country was, as one source puts it, starving for educated, skilled, next-generation leaders.
And true to the Yuk-hun, he decided he had to feed this hunger.
Exactly. But his response was on a scale that dwarfed even his ancestors' actions during the 1671 famine. He made a monumental decision. He chose not to try and rebuild his family's landed dynasty in the new, uncertain Korea. Instead, he decided to liquidate everything.
Everything. The entire 300-year fortune.
The entire remaining fortune. He sold off the vast Choe family estate. The land, the properties, everything that had been accumulated and carefully managed for 12 generations. He converted all of that private ancestral wealth into liquid cash assets.
Why? What was his goal?
His goal was education. In 1947, he took the entire proceeds from liquidating his family's fortune and used it to found 2 educational institutions: Daegu College and a classical studies institute called 𝐃𝐈𝐕𝐄.
With the specific aim of?
His explicit goal, stated at the time, was nurturing next-generation talent for the new nation. He saw education as the most critical investment Korea needed for its future. These 2 institutions he founded would later merge in 1967 to become the modern major Yeongnam University.
Okay, let's just pause and absorb the significance of this. He didn't just donate some money. He dissolved his entire dynasty's wealth to build schools.
It's the ultimate fulfillment of the Yuk-hun, but scaled up to the national level in a way his ancestors likely never imagined.
How so? Connect it back to the original precepts.
Well, think about Rule 4. Let no one starve within a 100-li radius. Choe Jun looked at post-liberation Korea and saw the entire nation, the Minjok, as his neighbor. The starvation he saw wasn't just lack of food, but lack of educated leadership. His granary wasn't just a storehouse of rice anymore. It was the entire Choe estate itself. And the food he provided wasn't porridge. It was the institutional foundation for higher education.
He transformed the meaning of the precepts for a new era.
Completely. And the sources confirm this was a deliberate, conscious act of what you might call creative destruction. He knew exactly what this meant for his own descendants. His grandson, Choe Yom, has spoken about this. He recalled his grandfather, Choe Jun, warning him directly.
What did he say?
He told his grandson essentially, look, if I use all my money to build these universities, you need to understand you're going to inherit nothing from me. No land, no fortune.
Wow. He was explicitly disinheriting his own bloodline financially.
It was an intentional sunsetting of the private dynasty. He made a conscious choice. Convert 12 generations of accumulated private wealth into a permanent, public, national legacy. He transformed his descendants' inheritance from material wealth to moral legacy. From being heirs of a great fortune, they became heirs of a great example. It's arguably the ultimate act of noblesse, obliged the nobility, willingly dissolving its own privilege for the perceived greater good of the nation.
So Choe Jun's plan worked, in a sense. His descendants, like his grandson Choe Yom, Inherited, as he warned, nothing financially. All they got was the family name, the moral honor, and maybe the weight of that history.
That's right. Even the symbol of their former power, that famous ancestral 99-bedroom house in Gyeongju. It's not owned or managed by the Choe family today. It's maintained and managed by Yungnam University, the very institution founded with the family's wealth. They literally gave away the family home, too.
And the grandson, Choe Jun, what became of him?
He effectively became the public face, the living embodiment of this incredible moral legacy. Apparently, as a child, his grandfather made him write out the 6 precepts, the Yuk-hun, every single morning. Talk about internalizing the family code.
Every morning. Wow.
So he grew up steeped in this philosophy. And in his adult life, he dedicated himself to lecturing, speaking publicly about the family's history and philosophy, often under the theme of how to be rich and respected. He inherited all the respect, you could say, but none of the riches.
But here's where this story takes a really ironic, almost bitter twist, isn't it? This legacy, built on sacrificing wealth and rigorously avoiding political entanglement, ultimately gets caught up in a modern political fight.
Exactly. It's a profound irony. The Yuk-hun was designed in large part to prevent exactly this kind of situation where political power interferes with the family's affairs or assets. Yet the conflict centers precisely on Yungnam University, the crown jewel of Choe Jun's sacrifice.
What happened? What was the flashpoint?
The irony was really crystallized by a specific event in May 2019. The administration of Yungnam University actually banned Choe Jun, the founder's grandson, from giving a lecture he was scheduled to deliver at the university.
They banned the founder's grandson from speaking at the university his grandfather founded. That seems unbelievable. What was the lecture about?
Get this. It was a lecture scheduled to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Korean Provisional Government.
The very government his grandfather, Choe Jun, risked his life and fortune to secretly fund through the Baeksan Trading Company.
Precisely. The symbolism is just staggering. So why would the university cancel that lecture, given by that person?
What was their official reason?
The university administration stated that the cancellation was because Choe Jun habitually criticized former President Park Chung-hee and the university's history.
Park Chung-hee. Okay, now we're getting into sensitive political territory. Explain the connection.
To understand this, we have to go back to 1967. Park Chung-hee was the military general who seized power in a coup in 1961 and ruled South Korea as an authoritarian president until his assassination in 1979. His era was marked by rapid, state-led industrialization, but also political repression.
And what happened in 1967 related to the university?
It was 1967, under Park Chung-hee's government, Daegu College, the main institution Choe Jun had founded, was merged with another local college. The sources use the term forcibly merged. This created the larger entity we now know as Yungnam University.
Okay, a merger. But what about the control?
Critically, at the time of the merger, President Park Chung-hee installed his own foundation, the Yungnam School Foundation, often linked to his associates or political apparatus, to take over control of the newly formed university's board and operations.
So the university founded by Choe Jun's wealth ended up under the effective control of a foundation linked to the country's military dictator.
That's the crux of the dispute. Now, fast forward back to Choe Jun, the grandson. His habitual criticism stems from his deeply held belief that this 1967 merger and takeover were illegitimate.
What's his specific claim?
His counterclaim, the reason he keeps speaking out, is that President Park Chung-hee's foundation contributed, in his words, 0-1 in donated assets to the university during or after the merger. He essentially argues that Park's regime took control of an institution built entirely with his grandfather's sacrificed fortune without contributing financially themselves. He has publicly called the university, under its current governance structure, stolen goods.
So he sees the Park family's continued influence over the university foundation as historically unjust and is demanding they withdraw.
That seems to be his position. He's fighting for what he sees as the restoration of the university's true legacy and independence from that particular political lineage.
This is just dripping with irony when you think back to the Yuk-hun.
Isn't it? Go back to the very first precept. Do not take a government post higher than Jinza. The entire philosophy was built on this fundamental principle of separating the family's wealth and affairs from the dangers of high political power. Avoid the state to protect your assets.
Choe Jun followed that rule religiously, right? He remained a private citizen, a philanthropist, never sought political office himself.
He did. He played by the family's centuries-old rules even as he adapted them to a national crisis. Yet, the ultimate tragic irony is that while he successfully protected the family's private wealth from the Joseon state by staying out of politics,
You couldn't protect the public institution he created with that wealth from being effectively seized and controlled by the most powerful political figure in the 20th century state, President Park Chung-hee.
Exactly. The very thing the Yuk-hun was designed to prevent the entanglement of their legacy with state power happened anyway, but to the result of their sacrifice, not to the family fortune itself. Choe Jun's descendant, Choe Jun, is left with no financial power because his ancestors deliberately gave it away and only his moral voice to contest the control of the institution his grandfather built.
It's a really stark illustration of the enduring tension between private philanthropy, public legacy, and the reach of state power, isn't it?
Absolutely. A conflict playing out even today, rooted in decisions made centuries ago.
So if we step back and look at this whole 300-year story, this incredible arc from Choe surviving the 1671 famine by feeding his neighbors, all the way to Choe Jun liquidating everything in 1947 to build schools for the nation.
What's the through line? I think the constant theme is this practice of almost willed self-limitation. A conscious decision, generation after generation, to cap their own wealth, to institutionalize its dispersal, and to invest heavily in social capital, in community well-being. They seem to understand, perhaps better than anyone, that the only way to make private wealth truly durable across centuries of turmoil was to embed it within a network of public trust.
And that legacy, that approach, it really stands out today, doesn't it? Especially when compared to how modern wealth sometimes operates. The sources explicitly draw this contrast.
Yes, the Choe family story is often held up in Korea as a shining example of noblesse oblige in practice. And it's often contrasted, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, with the challenges faced by some of South Korea's giant modern conglomerates, the chaebol.
Right, the cable. For our listeners outside Korea, maybe quickly define that term.
Sure. Chaebol refers to these massive, family-control industrial conglomerates that dominate the South Korean economy. Think Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK Group. Huge, powerful entities, often still controlled by the founding families or their descendants.
And these cable, while incredibly successful economically, sometimes face public criticism or scandals, right? Issues around succession, political influence, transparency.
Exactly. The sources mention that Chaebol often find themselves needing to restore their fallen reputation in the public eye after controversies related to, say, cozy relationships with politicians, opaque inheritance practices, or accusations of prioritizing family control over shareholder or public interests.
And the point is, the Choe clan's Yuk-hun basically built in safeguards against those very issues.
Precisely. Look at the rules again. Rule 2, cap your wealth at 10,000 suk, actively preventing the kind of endless, potentially resentment-inducing accumulation we sometimes see.
Rule 4, mandate public service, let no one starve, making community contribution a core operating principle, not just optional philanthropy.
And Rule 1, strictly separate wealth from political influence, do not take high office, avoiding the very government entanglements that often cause problems for large corporations today.
So they earned respect and longevity precisely because their philosophy was built on humility, sustainability, and this rigorous commitment to serving the public good, not just maximizing private gain.
It seems so. They weren't just doing charity on the side. They structured their entire existence around an ethical framework that provided a kind of historical counter-narrative. It suggests that immense wealth doesn't have to inevitably lead to public resentment or eventual confiscation if it's managed with profound ethical constraint and a sense of public stewardship.
So that popular phrase, the 60 billion won sacrifice, it really misses the point, doesn't it?
It really does. It focuses on the final act, the monetary value. But the real story isn't just about the money given away at the end. It's about the 300 years of adhering to this radical philosophy. A philosophy that fundamentally viewed wealth not as a private possession to be hoarded and maximized, but as a temporary public trust to be managed responsibly and shared generously.
Their final act, dissolving the dynasty to found the university, wasn't just a sacrifice then. It was the logical conclusion, the ultimate expression of that 300-year philosophy.
Exactly. It was a conscious decision to transform their private dynastic legacy into a public, permanent, national one. They really are arguably the definitive Korean example of noblesse oblige in its most profound form.
This whole deep dive, it really leaves you thinking about what sustainable wealth truly means, especially across long, turbulent periods of history.
It does. The Choe clan's story seems to demonstrate this almost paradoxical idea that sometimes the most secure form of wealth, the kind that truly endures and earns lasting respect, might actually be the wealth you intentionally limit, the wealth you consciously give away or reinvest in the community. It's an incredible testament to structural humility and long-term strategic vision.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. If the ultimate goal isn't just short-term profit, but maybe generational longevity, respect, survival through unpredictable change like the Choe clan achieved for 300 years. What modern assets would need that same kind of conscious limitation or public conversion?
Think beyond just money. What about things like influence, intellectual property, access to data, your company's reputation? If you wanted your family's legacy or your organization's legacy to be respected and protected by the community 300 years from now, what portion of those assets would you need to deliberately cap, share, or transform into a public service?
It's a profound question about the nature of wealth and responsibility, posed by the actions of a 17th century Korean aristocratic family, but maybe more relevant today than ever.
A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the incredible story of the Gyeongju Choe clan.